Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another short on my behalf. I am Shan, and today I'm going to be talking about Saudi Arabia and the mystery surrounding everything going on in Saudi Arabia in the past 1.5 weeks. So, first, I'm going to talk about who the current prince is in the spotlight, and whom most of you have probably heard about in the kind of first parts in the whole Saudi Arabian saga, which is still continuing to unravel. So, the current prince. Who is the son of the current King Salman, is Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He's the son of King Salman of Saudi Arabia, and as he said about 2 weeks ago, he aims to move the nation to a more moderate form of Islam. He has previously advocated for allowing women to drive in the country. He was one of the key proponents of that law, and women have started driving in Saudi Arabia as a result of him and his father's backing of such legislation that would allow women to do so. He also aims to move Saudi Arabia to cleaner energy sources such as electrical and solar energy that's not driven by oil and coal, partially driven by the historical low costs of alternative energy in 2017 and this year. And that's why a lot of countries are moving towards alternative forms of energy because of how low they cost, how cheap they are in the global market right now, and as a result, the rising oil costs in the global market that OPEC can't really drive down. OPEC is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is an organization of countries that mainly deal in oil. Saudi Arabia is one of the key exponents of that organization. So that drives oil costs up in the global market, and it's also partially driven by the fact that the World Bank and several other supranational organizations, which include the UN, the World Trade Organization, the European Union, and OPEC, as I previously mentioned, have predicted that Saudi Arabia will be running out of oil within the next 5 years. Now, this statistic came back as early as 2015, so these supranational organizations headed by the World Bank and the IMF have predicted that they will run out of oil by 2020 if they don't move to cleaner coal methods, and they might run out of energy and be increasingly in debt to the global market by 2020 if they don't quickly move to alternative forms of energy, which is why Prince Salman is advocating for the moves that he is advocating for in terms of global energy. And the last thing I want to talk about, which is probably the most important in the context of whatever is going on in Saudi Arabia right now, is that he is extremely anti-Iran. He calls their leaders, as well as the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the current spiritual leader of Iran, extremists who practice an illiberal and blasphemic form of Islam and poses a nuclear threat to both the West and the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia has historically had a regional stronghold over the Middle East because it is a rentier state, which means it deals in one main natural resource in which it gains most of its revenues and where its economy mostly runs off of, which would be oil in this case. And it has strong ties with the West, as especially the United States, the single strongest economy in the world, and the country that has probably, inarguably, the most influence on the Middle East in terms of countries in the West. So basically, the next thing I want to get to is what exactly is happening in Saudi Arabia. So on Saturday, November 4th, several top-tier Saudi administration officials and members of the royal family were purged and removed from their offices in the Saudi government. And the next day, which would be Sunday on November 5th, a helicopter crash in Yemen killed another Saudi prince of the royal family who was suspected to have strong Iran ties. He might not have supported Iran's policies, but he did have ties to the Iranian government, which is very, very much anti-Saudi. We'll get into why the Saudis and the Iranians have this kind of proxy battle going on in between themselves in the Middle East. And the same day that helicopter crash happened, later on in that day, in fact, the Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, he resigned after fears of assassination attempts from the Houthi rebels, who we'll get to later. They're Iranian-backed rebels based in Yemen. The same day as the Yemen missile strikes, in addition to the helicopter crash, there were missile strikes that came from Yemen that struck Riyadh in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Riyadh is the capital of KSA. So the fact that he resigned really gave off some indicative negative markers about the growing threat of a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as there are a lot of pro-Iran, anti-Saudi Arabian forces that are present in Yemen, one of them being the Houthis. We'll get to them later. And this has been seen as a power grab by the Saudi royal prince to remove his competitors. A lot of people, especially the Iranian government, have been saying that this is an inside job that has been perpetrated by the Saudi royal family, especially the prince and the king, King Salman and Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to remove his competitors who have strong Iran ties, and in order to consolidate power for themselves. And given what we know so far, it may also be backed by the West, especially the United States and other Gulf countries that are very close to Saudi Arabia and very strong economically, such as the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Oman. Because, and another reason why is because Iran is a Shiite majority country and has had several quarrels and political power struggles with these nations in the past in the Middle East. Because countries such as the KSA, UAE, Kuwait, and Oman are Sunni majority, who are the majority of Muslims not only in the Middle East but in the world. And the Shia majority countries such as Iran have always had religious quarrels with these countries, and now it has transitioned into political and economic quarrels. So now I want to get into a brief background on the KSA and Iran relationship. So the first thing that you guys will probably need to know, just as complete basic background, is that KSA, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is an absolute monarchy with complete executive and legislative power over its people, which means the monarchy makes the laws and enforces the laws over its people at all times without any other governmental bodies. There are local elections, but from a national level, everything is controlled by the royal family. Iran, on the other hand, is an Islamic theocracy with a much more complex governmental form, because the democratic aspect of Iran's government comes into play, where the Ayatollah Khomeini approves of the presidential candidates to run in the general elections that Iran has in a cyclical basis, and the people vote for the president. But the president first has to be approved by the spiritual leader Ayatollah Khomeini. And the people also have no say in the appointment of the Ayatollah Khomeini, which makes it basically an Islamic dictatorship, a theocracy, which then trickles down into a democracy when it comes to him sanctioning presidents running for elections and people voting for a president. So before the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which we'll talk about a little bit later, Iran was a constitutional monarchy under the Pahlavi dynasty, and the Shah of Iran was the last member of the Pahlavi dynasty before he was overthrown in the 79 revolution. And the Pahlavi dynasty was the last dynasty in a continuation of over 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy. So it's been going on for a long period of time, the dynastical rule of Iran, until it was turned into an Islamic republic. So the people in 1979, the people of Iran chose to overthrow the Pahlavi dynasty government, and the Shah even fled to the United States to avoid assassination, because the Iranian people were getting increasingly skeptical of his ties to the West, especially the United States, as the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, was accused of killing the Shah's opposition about 4 years prior, who advocated for an Islamic theocracy early on. And the CIA did, a few years ago, in fact, I believe, maybe not a few years ago, but a few decades ago, in the 90s, I believe it was, they released classified documents proving that they, in fact, did perpetrate the killing of the pro-Islamic theocracy candidate in the election against the Shah. And that led to the Iranian people kind of wanting to go against the Pahlavi dynasty and the Shah government, and that led to the overthrowing of the Shah and the implementation of a spiritual Islamic theocracy headed by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is the father of the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is currently the Ayatollah. And it was driven mainly by Islamic and leftist organizations taking over all aspects of government and distancing themselves from the West, especially the United States, and appointing the Ayatollah Khomeini as their spiritual leader because they did not want a secularized country. And the Shah aimed to increasingly secularize societal aspects of the country as well as industry. The next thing I want to get to is that the Saudi royals, as a result of the 79 revolution, have feared an Islamist and leftist uprising in their country since the Iranian Revolution, which is why they have such stringent rules on protests, which is why you rarely have any protests when it comes to Western countries, and even Iranian ambassadors coming into Saudi Arabia and meeting with Saudi Arabian royals. because it's punishable by death. They don't want any uprisings there. And Iran has urged other Middle Eastern countries to implement Islamic theocracies instead of monarchies that are modeled by the KSA, to instill the will of the people into government rather than the will of powerful bureaucrats and the members of the royal family, which is why they believe that their form of government is correct over the Saudi royals' dictatorship, essentially. So these two conflicting viewpoints of government have led to a bunch of proxy wars breaking out in the Middle East, essentially between Saudi Arabian forces or pro-Saudi forces and anti-Saudi, pro-Iran forces and militants who want an Islamic theocracy in throughout the entirety of the Middle East, basically. And one last thing I want to say: they meaning the KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is also an enemy of Al Qaeda for its ties to the West and opposition to an Islamic theocracy, which is what Al Qaeda's main tenets are formed off of: an Islamic theocracy, an extremist Islamic theocracy. And the KSA has been accused of making ransom payments to Al Qaeda in order to keep militants off of the backs of the royal family and to keep the atmosphere, the both political and societal atmosphere, safe in Saudi Arabia from potential attacks from Al Qaeda, because while there is a strong U.S. military presence there, they do not have that much of a say in terms of what should be done in case of a terrorist attack in Saudi Arabia, just because it's so rare, because of the ransom payments they have made to these terrorist groups, and Al Qaeda being the most significant group. So as a result of this, there have been several proxy wars that have led to the current situation but in the Middle East between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran. So they've been heavily involved in their own proxy wars since the 79 revolution as a means to try and gather more and more influence over the Middle Eastern politics and prevent other countries from converting into the other's form of government, which is very replicative of the USSR Cold War phenomena that went on throughout the majority of the mid to late 1900s. Except this time it's going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. So the most significant of these proxy wars, while there have been many in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, even Egypt, which was catalyzed by the 2011 Arab Spring, but that's another discussion for later. The most significant of these proxy wars has been the Yemen crisis. It's a complete humanitarian crisis. There are hundreds of people dying each day because of the ongoing battle between the Saudi government and the Houthi rebels in trying to implement different forms of government in Yemen, which has led to the Yemeni government fleeing overseas and leaving the country in a constant state of emergency. Anti-Saudi Arabian militants, they're known as the Houthi rebels, named after their founder, Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi, are trying to rid Yemen of Saudi influence and gain governmental control of the country, implementing Sharia and an Islamic theocracy with the backing of Iran. Iran has backed the Houthi rebels, it has always denied allegations and accusations of financially or militaristically backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen, as that would be a violation of the international treaty. I can't recall the name of the exact treaty, but which would prevent one country in the Middle East or even anywhere in the world from meddling in another government's issues, basically collusion or the potential purposeful sabotage of another country's government. So Yemen is now a hotbed for attacks against Iranian and Saudi ambassadors and members of the royal family, which is why many speculate that Iran-backed rebels were behind the helicopter crash that killed a Saudi prince in Yemen. And this is where the connection is made to the current situation and the KSA-Iran proxy wars that have been going on in the Middle East for over 20 to 30 years now. It's rumored that the Saudi prince Mohammed bin Salman, with the backing of his father, the king, is ridding the Saudi government of Iran sympathizers or simply taking power away from the Salman, who are taking power away from the Salman dynasty. And Iran has been very against the royal family, as you can imagine, as well, for the most part against the Salman family, because they're the current ones in power, trying to overthrow their regime by any means possible. So they're trying to turn this into a Sunni-Shia fight, which is, I think, the best way if you're thinking about how to strive for self-preservation in terms of the Salman family. They're trying to turn this into a religious fight between Sunnis and Shias, which is the only way that they can perceivably win by convincing their citizens that Iran is the bad guy, in order to try to consolidate power by convincing their allies and their citizens, as I've mentioned before, of the impending threat of Shiite Iran. And Iran has vehemently denied any accusations of the possibility of a looming threat. Hassan Rouhani, the Iranian president, has himself said that they're not in any way involved in the crisis going on in Yemen right now, either financially or militaristically, and they do not aim to turn any country in the Middle East into a Shia majority country, as they're very much alone, because the other countries are Sunni majority, as I have mentioned before. And now, as a result of this proxy war, there's a regional divide between Jordan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt, who are the anti-Islamists and the anti-rebel force countries, and Iran, Iraq of which is very much controlled by Iran after the Iraq war, which just destabilized the geopolitical situation in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. These four countries are pro-Islamist theocracies and revolutionaries in Yemen. And Yemen, as a result, not only is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but it's also backed by countries that are on both sides of the issue. On Saudi Arabia's side, you have Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, and on Iran's side, you have Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. The U.S., however, hasn't addressed the issue yet, though expected to back the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and anti-Islamist forces, which may turn into another proxy war if Russia enters and backs its proxy allies in Syria and Lebanon, which it is very much involved in terms of international relations, which is why the Russians have deployed a lot of missiles in order to kill anti-government revolutionary forces in the Syrian civil war in the past 4 or 5 years. So it's a very intense situation right now. It's very much a Cold War situation, and if Iran is in the works of a nuclear weapon, which will be catalyzed after the Iran deal, if it continues without any caveats, then it could turn into a potential all-out war in the Middle East, which will further destabilize the region. Thank you so much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back with another podcast, I believe next week, where me and Bilal will talk about a pertinent issue. And thank you so much for listening once again.